Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of our Parent Power Hour, brought to you by Family and Community Engagement, otherwise known as FACE. We're the face of the district. We are here to support our families. Today, we have a great session, helping traumatized students learn. And with us, we have Elizabeth Tanner. She is the supervisor for emotional wellness, and her co-presenter is Angela Weck. Sorry, Angela. I just know that beautiful first name. I don't know why it's just so beautiful. And she is with the district mental health. She is a district mental health clinician. So with that, Elizabeth and Angela, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Miss Angela. I appreciate the warm welcoming. And I want to welcome all of our parents on this wonderful presentation that we hope to give you. And we hope that this is very informative to you, and you will have some takeaways from this presentation on how to help your child be a more successful student, be emotionally well. And we're going to talk about some very interesting topics regarding mental health and in relation to a traumatic event and trauma. And then talk about some resources as well. So we're going to dive into this presentation so that we'll have time for questions at the end. Thank you again all for having us and for being here today and for your participation. So we're going to go to the next slide and talk a little bit about just the outlook for the training today. Initially, what we're going to talk about is what is trauma? What are we talking about when we are looking at traumatic events and the impact that it will have on students in learning? And then what are some signs and symptoms that you as a parent can be aware of and to look out for in regards to students that are at their elementary level, the middle school level, and our high school students? And then we will wrap up this presentation and learn about ways that you can support your child and how we support students at our schools. A big thing to keep in mind is some of the data that we've received from our pandemic. We are still in a pandemic and dealing with the ramifications of COVID, dealing with what kind of behaviors we're seeing post-COVID, and still kind of navigating those waters. We have a partner in Hillsborough County and in Tampa, the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay, and the Crisis Center yields a lot of calls. You might see flyers that say call 211. Instead of calling 911, we call 211 if you're having more of a mental health crisis or you are in need of assistance or support in some way. And looking at our data, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, we can see some interesting numbers. If you're looking at the slide here in front of you, kind of on the left-hand side where it starts with rent and mortgage, these were calls that we kind of got from this data is from the Crisis Center. These are the calls that they've received. And a lot of them were in regards to rent and mortgage, employment, loss of a job. This was kind of like right when we were in the middle of COVID, where it got started in March, and then that July, they received so many calls for just basic financial assistance because many of our parents, our community members were losing their jobs or not having a job. And then as a result, they had issues with medical care, their bills and finances, and just had difficulty even paying their mortgage. So we saw the Crisis Center yield and field a lot of those type of calls. However, as we shift now moving forward, not stabilizing due to government programs and what have you, we are seeing an uptick from the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay in our calls for mental health issues and mental health concerns. You can see that 48% of the calls that they are fielding from people all over Tampa Bay are in regards to some mental health concerns. So that's a significant increase. And we are also seeing this with students at our school levels, no matter if it's elementary, middle, or high, that they're showing some of these mental health concerns as well. But not to mention that we're still seeing high numbers where financial assistance is required, housing, emotional support, and even eating basic food meals. So as we go to the next slide, another type of percentage of calls that we're getting a lot of is our suicide type calls. So at the beginning of the pandemic, if somebody is calling in, this could be an adult or a child, they may have, a crisis feeling that they are suicidal. They want to kill themselves. And between March and October, that was about 4% of the calls. Now for November moving forward, we're seeing those calls ramp up to about 8%. And this could be due to many different factors that we'll talk about, but it is concerning that we are seeing a higher number of calls for folks that are feeling suicidal. That may be because of some of their environmental issues that are happening because of COVID and because of other environmental factors as well. So what other kind of things have we seen? And this is across the gamut, I think, in our not only local Hillsborough County, Tampa, the state of Florida, across our nation. These are issues that not only our students are having to face daily, but our adults and parents. And these type of events that happen are types of trauma, okay? And we'll go into that definition of a traumatic event. But the constant fear, of getting sick, or the fear of losing a job, or the fear of, not having a stable income or stable household is something that we've seen quite a bit of in our students and our even our staff and our parents. But also, we are dealing with nationwide issues such as discrimination, violence in our neighborhoods, violence across our nation, injustices. A lot of folks are dealing with grief. We've had so many people that have lost somebody or know somebody that was in a colleague, someone they've worked with, perhaps a family member that have passed away, maybe from COVID, but maybe not. But we have seen that has been an ongoing issue, that they're dealing with that type of grief. But also worry, anxiety, feeling isolated. Maybe they're having to quarantine, not go to school. We have teachers that are having to quarantine, parents that quarantine. So all of those disruptions in your natural schedule can cause distress and anxiety. And that is something that can lead to stressful situations and harm your emotional wellness or your mental health overall. So I kind of brought up that term of trauma, and really, what does that mean? When we're talking about a traumatic event, it is an experience that somebody has that's very powerful. It can overwhelm a person. If you're exposed to a traumatic event, you might not think very clearly. You may not be able to cope with those feelings. But it's very important that what may be traumatic to me, or maybe traumatic to a family member of mine, a friend, might be very different to somebody else. We all handle trauma differently. I might be able to cope with something a little bit easier than somebody else with the same type of event. And we'll give you some examples of those. Actually, we'll go to the next slide. I'll show you some different types of trauma, and we'll give you some examples. So an acute trauma, is something that might happen just one time, one particular place, and it's usually short-lived. For example, perhaps you were in a car accident, and that can be very traumatic. You're dealing with insurance companies and all of that, and you might be hurt. And you might be able to overcome that traumatic event pretty easily and say, nope, we're fine, I'm fine, everybody was okay, and we'll get the car fixed. Or that might hit you very hard and say, geez, I don't really want to drive anymore. Like I feel like I need some help because it was a pretty bad car accident. But that's an example of an acute trauma. More chronic trauma is things that happen consistently over time. So if you have suffered one loss and maybe and then another loss of a family member, or let's just say you are being physically abused or verbally abused, and it continues over and over again, that's more of a chronic trauma. Our historical trauma is the collective and cumulative trauma experienced by a particular group across several generations, such as discrimination against certain groups of people. That type of historical trauma has a long-lasting effect on folks because it is also continuous, just based on, where their background and culture is from. And then you have your complex trauma, which is exposure to trauma that begins very early in life, often with a caregiver. So some of our students perhaps that don't have a consistent home life, or were taken away from their caregivers at a very young age, or did not receive the nurturing support at a very young age, they could have some very serious complex trauma. Okay. So as we move to our next slide, let's just talk about some of the long-term effects of trauma. Like I said, every person kind of deals with these situations in different ways. So it's kind of different how folks will show their symptoms of dealing with traumatic events. What we do know is that despite those signs and symptoms, if you do not address trauma, if you don't provide intervention and support to students or even adults that are dealing with trauma, it can affect their mental health, it can affect their emotional well-being, and it can affect them cognitively as well. So it's very important that we recognize those traumatic symptoms that will go on and know that this isn't, a done deal. We can overcome traumatic events. We can provide support and interventions for our students and our children to then move on from them and feel very happy and supported and productive individuals. It's when we don't provide those interventions and we don't identify them that it could lead to more long-term effects. So looking at some of those types of impacts that we're talking about is when we're experiencing a traumatic event, like let's just say, let's just say somebody was dealing with financial issues because they were let off from work or fired, and we're not sure where we're going to be living, or maybe you're in a relationship that's not healthy and you're witnessing violence or abuse. Some of the symptoms and the impacts that we have are students that feel an oversense of anxiety and fear. They are antsy, often are on edge. They might not want to eat or eat too much. There could be a change in appetite. Same thing, sometimes students want to sleep too much or don't sleep enough at all. And you would see a change in their sleeping patterns. They can't focus and concentrate. They're irritable. And they might result in use of drugs or alcohol to cope with that. And they have a sense of hopelessness. Now, I want you to be very careful about this because a lot of our students, especially our teens, or those that are transitioning, from elementary to middle to adolescence and young adulthood, these are natural signs and symptoms. And it's natural for a student to feel anxiety at school sometimes if they have to take a test, or maybe they don't want to eat as much as they used to. Perhaps they're staying up a little bit later than they used to because they want to talk to their friends, and they can't have a hard time falling asleep then because they're just all wound up. Those are typical types of signs and symptoms. But when these signs and symptoms start to affect their ability to be social, to live, to go be productive and be a productive citizen, like going to school, going to church, being able to hold a job. And if those signs and symptoms affect them being themselves, where they're not able to be productive citizens, this is where we're starting to say these signs and symptoms need to be addressed, and we need to fix them, because it's not just your typical worry or anxiety or fear or sleep issues. This is interfering with them in their lives. So let's not forget that you will just have also some physical types of symptoms as well, things that we can really see. A student might, claim to have stomach aches or make themselves throw up more. Perhaps you'll see them sweating, or they have stomach problems, that type of thing. Those are actual physical symptoms that can occur from ongoing anxiety and traumatic events because they're not addressed. And then you can actually see some of those high-risk behaviors that we're talking about. So some of our students, to cope with those traumatic events and they're not getting the help, will, go out late at night without letting you know, or seek attention from a group of friends maybe that they hadn't before, or break the rules or laws such as smoking or drinking or taking drugs or what have you. Those are some physical types of behaviors that we can see that we would want to address right away. So just to look at some of these other age-related types of behaviors, and these can really vary from our elementary to middle and high school students. But students that have been exposed to a traumatic event and it's not addressed, you will kind of notice sometimes that they need that increased need of support, almost like they're regressing. They used to be pretty independent and could play on their own and didn't need me as the adult always around. And you'll see that regression happen. Maybe they're just clingy more than usual. They also just can become more aggressive. You're like, gosh, you were never so defiant before or irritable. What's bothering you? Why are you, so impulsive and getting upset so quickly? The somatic complaints are what we're talking about with that physical behavior. A student might say, I need to go see the nurse, but there's really nothing wrong. Or my tummy hurts, or I don't feel right. But there's no medical reason for them to feel that way. The sleeping problems we talk about is very common in our elementary students when they are having some major signs and symptoms due to a traumatic event. And then you'll see it at school too. They're just kind of not able to focus. Their teacher might say things like, I'm always having to get their attention. They seem like they're out of it sometimes. And it's usually because they're thinking about that traumatic event or reliving some of those, or just have that overall angst and worry that we need to address. So with our older students, those behaviors kind of can be similar, but they're at a different level. Those somatic complaints may result actually in actual, issues with, showing that they're sweating or not, or some of those physical complaints that we're talking about. So those increase even more. That agitation just doesn't go away. They're failing their classes. They're not doing their schoolwork. They're not organized. They're not caring about school a little bit more. You'll see like they want to withdraw from events at school or their friends or teachers. Perhaps an increase in substance abuse. And you'll see that withdrawal not only from the students and their peers, but from adults too. So when you're seeing that withdrawal in multiple settings, that could be a reaction from a traumatic event.
So when we look,
turning it over to Angela. Okay,
when we look at specifically at COVID-19, what we've all gone through for the last 18 months, there is certainly trauma that we have to discuss when we talk about the experiences we've all had. This quote is quoted from a book that we've used in some previous trainings, that from a young boy who talks about, I don't care if first grade will be fun. I want to stay in kindergarten with my teacher. And I think it just reflects their reluctance to move on because they feel like they've had a loss. They didn't experience school the way that maybe they thought they would, or as their school year began or school started. So we have to, realize that when schools began shutting down, even last year, where you had a great majority or a large majority in some schools online and then some students in person, that impacted students' connections with others, their classmates, and what we think of as that typical type of school experience. So what about trauma and COVID-19? There have been some challenges. Many of our students have had those, like Elizabeth talked about, those kind of disruptions in that secure childhood. The economic stressors, maybe a loss or reduction of one of their caregivers' income, their interpersonal stressors, isolation from their friends, maybe separation from family members, and that they typically might have had a close relationship with and seen frequently. Certainly the health and safety, being told you have to wear a mask, you have to hand sanitize. That's certainly not part of most of us. What we think about is our typical childhood. And then those changes in the social safety net, with loss of jobs, sometimes that's a loss of health insurance or food on the table or disruption in housing. And those were all challenges. But we also see there were some benefits for some of our students. Students that felt marginalized or were bullied, students often that were, had trouble succeeding in a large educational environment, just navigating that school setting, already had underlying anxiety prior to the pandemic, allowing them to be behind a computer screen working in a smaller setting was very, very beneficial. Or maybe they were just introverted as their nature. And so we've seen this school year an uptick in those students seeking out mental health services, describing to their families and to the adults at school that increased anxiety, because last year they kind of had a reprieve and it was a much more positive educational experience than maybe what they had had in previous years. And then we also have to think about the benefit from increased time with family. That benefited many children, many families like that. We've seen people even choose to stay remote because of that increased family time. So that all affected our lives. So when you're exposed to trauma, when you're going through something that is difficult, the body will have two very distinct reactions. Trauma is when a person experiences stress that's too much or it goes on for too long. And so your body dysregulates. It's actually it just does it. It's part of the way we're brought, our neurological instincts, that fight, flight, or freeze. So there's two kind of typical responses: that hyperarousal that's reflective. You become irritable, you become impatient. You struggle to recognize anybody else's point of view. You're kind of hyper focused on what's going on around you. And I like this analogy of, it's kind of like you put your foot on the gas. You have intense energy. You're very reactive to what's going on. You might be more impulsive that you might not normally do because of that reflective hyperarousal state. And then the other response is that hypoarousal, which is kind of a shutting down, where the body shuts down. Your energy level decreases. You just kind of feel numb, withdrawn. And the analogy there is the foot on the brake. You just kind of appear like you're disconnected, but that still can be a reaction to trauma. So how do we do that? How do we deal with this impact of this collective trauma that we've all been through? And that is what experts call when a society collectively goes through a difficult event. It's happened to us before, World War II, war times, those sorts of things. And this is certainly no different. But there's an opportunity. If we come together, we can find hope. We can make things better for others. We can promote change. We can maybe anticipate if something similar happens in our lifetime, how to prevent some of the kind of roadblocks or stumbles that we took. And that is called collective post-traumatic growth. And that's what we're trying to help families achieve and students achieve and our communities achieve. And I love this quote from that same book. It says, it's a little boy named Ames who says, "It's going to be okay. because we're doing this together, right? And we really do, we are really all going through this together. So with that point, we want to provide you some really concrete steps of how we can support our children. Our children take our cues. They take their cues from us. We are the adults. They're looking to us to see how do we handle certain situations or difficulties in our lives. So we are going to give you some concrete steps on how we can support the young people in our lives. And the first one is to be calm and proactive. Understand that students aren't going to maybe understand. Young people aren't going to understand. They're going to have anxiety. And we need to help them, open up our minds to having those discussions with them. What do you believe? What are you scared of? What do you fear? And dispel maybe any misconceptions they might have. Give them as much reassurance as we can about the concerns that they have. But they pick up our tone. So if we're calm, if we say, you know what, we don't know why some people die and some people don't, or why some people get COVID and some people don't. But let's maybe do some research, or let's talk about that. And what we can do is we can do what we can do for each other. And by doing that, we also help protect those that we might be concerned of, make them look outward a little bit instead of just always inward. How can we be part of that larger community? Because the whole community is going through this. Stick to a routine. Children often need structure, and this really helps students and young people get through days. We would strongly recommend that you have a schedule in place, and that's, young people know what their expectations are, what's happening. Certainly things occur and they change the schedule. But if we have time to connect with each other, allow them to connect with their friends, time to do schoolwork, time to play outside, time to do extracurricular activities, and they know that that's a predictable pattern, that increases their security, decreases a person's anxiety, and kind of allows them to know what to expect next. And we suggest, getting your children involved. If they get to the age of 10 or 11, they should certainly be part of figuring out what they want to do, what the schedule should be like, what their responsibilities are in your household, when they want to complete those, tasks or chores, and make sure that, they're part of that. That's a great way for them to get buy-in and understand what the importance is of planning out their day, those types of skills they need to be, responsible, functioning adults when they get older. Let your child feel their emotions. Students have had losses. There have been, class that graduated the school year in 2021, didn't have a normal last 2 years of high school. They didn't have a prom. They had a limited graduation, limited, attendees. That's a loss. We have a different perspective because we realize, a high school prom was a long time ago, and that doesn't really matter. Or, I didn't go to my high school prom. But we are looking at it with many more years of experience, of time, knowing what's important and not important in life. But for them, it's a real loss. And acknowledging their emotions, acknowledging what they've gone through, that empathy we can show to them can allow them to feel their emotions and move past it, and really helps them feel the grief, but feel that support, and helps them move past, as life goes on. Check in with your child, ask them what they're scared of, what they're thinking of, if what they know, what they're hearing. Young people talk to each other. They're on social media, they're on the internet. Find out, check in with them, what they're thinking, what they're looking at, if they have concerns. And by asking them what they're thinking about it, it also helps us, dispel any misconceptions they might have, allay any fears that they have, instead of just kind of guessing where they may be feeling, kind of allowing them to express what they're scared of or concerned about or worried, or how things are impacting them. It also will allow you to check and see how are they adjusting. If your young person was online and now they're back in school, how are those social connections going on? How are they doing academically? Is there anything that you need to be aware of as their parent or their caregiver? And certainly if those things need to be addressed, then you have that information, and we have so many resources at our schools, so many people that want to help students be successful, and you can bring it to the appropriate adult's attention. Create welcome distractions. When it comes to processing maybe difficult emotions, take your cues from your child and really think a lot about balancing talking about feelings with finding distractions, and allow distractions when kids need relief from feeling very upset. Have those family game nights, cook meals together. Those are all really important things in our children's lives. Watch the screen time. I think I just heard on the radio this morning, they estimate that those young people that are on TikTok spend an average of an hour and a half on TikTok a day. That's an average. We may need to rein that back a little bit because things have been a little relaxed. There's been that social isolation. How many of us have had Zoom, happy hours or interactions with families over the last 18 months. So it's not always negative, but it may now be the time to kind of dial back those that internet access or those different social media channels that we're going through. And that's going to be difficult. We're not saying it's not, but include your teen or your young person in those conversations about how should we handle this. I mean, it's ultimately up to you. You're the parent, but include them in their discussion. And then monitor your behavior. When I started, we all feel anxiety. Kids, though, take their emotional cues from us. Take care of yourself. There's that old adage when you get on an airplane and they talk about the air mask deploying, they say, put the mask on yourself before assisting anyone else, because if you can't breathe, you can't allow anyone else to breathe. And I think about that way about managing our own anxiety, taking care of ourselves so we can better take care of our children. And it may be hard at times for us to contain our emotions, but children rely on their parents to provide a sense of safety and security. So it's important, to remember that we're driving the car and they are the passengers in the car. So we want to, even if we're feeling anxious, we want our passengers in our car to feel safe, that they're in a safe environment. And then connect with school on an ongoing basis. Ongoing research shows that family engagement in schools improves student achievement, it reduces absenteeism, it restores parents' confidence in their children's education, and students with involved parents or other caregivers earn higher grades and test scores, they have better social skills, and they show improved behaviors. So our schools have many resources, including site-based school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers. In addition, we have mental health support in over 100 of our schools to provide that extra support for our students. So reach out and connect with those students about what resources may be available. So before we turn it over to questions, we just want to remind you of kind of these important points. If we provide consistent support to our children, we can help them deal with the events in our world and better prepare them for life. So at this point, we'll turn it over to any questions.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. It was so informative. And I do see we have questions. This question was the first question. Does the school district offer training for teachers who are interested in making our classroom safe spaces for traumatized students?
Yes, we do.
Question. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Angel.
Well, well, I'm sure I'm not going to think of everything, because we do have many classes on creating a trauma-informed classroom, explaining some of these concepts that we introduce to teachers to help them understand, recognize it. If you've got a student that's falling asleep in class, or, is just exhibiting maybe behavior that's different from their typical behavior, that's certainly a warning sign. So that helps. We also train our teachers on something called Youth Mental Health First Aid, which is a 6-hour course that helps teachers recognize those early signs and symptoms of a mental health challenge, and then teaches them to kind of have those difficult conversations, because sometimes they may see something, but really don't know how to address it. And we're not asking them to become mental health clinicians or counselors, but just start the conversation with that student or a parent, and then link them with the resources, as I said before, the school counselors, the school psychologists, the school social workers that help give those additional support in the schools. Elizabeth, do you want to add anything?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Our youth mental health first aid training, and then we offer several trauma-based trainings to our teachers too, so they understand what trauma is and the impacts.
Awesome, thank you for that. Another question is, what resources are available inside schools, and where do parents need to address these resources?
So yeah, that's an excellent question. Your school is a resource. We have on campus school counselors, school social workers, school psychologists. Your school counselors are the most consistent. They're usually there every day. And some of those other positions of the social worker or psychologist might be there at your child's school certain days during the week. But those folks are mental health professionals that can speak to your child. They can offer interventions. They can consult with you as the parent to see what might work best to help and support your students' mental health well-being. So if you're ever not sure, you can always reach out to your student's teacher and say, I'd like to meet with that person, or those student services folks on campus, the counselor. Or you can just come to the school or call and ask to speak with a social worker, psychologist, or counselor, and they would be able to assist you and your family and your student, making sure that they get the appropriate mental health interventions. In addition to that, we have contracted with a lot of community agencies and partners that provide more intensive level of mental health support, such as therapy or evaluation or other wraparound services. So the folks at the school can connect you as the parent to those community resources, and we can help you get associated with those mental health resources in our community so that your child can get the support and intervention that they need.
Okay, so that was a great answer to that question. And here's one that leads right into it. How does one know when it's time to involve the school level team, or when to approach the school level team, like the school psychologist or guidance for those services?
Yeah, for sure. And I would just say, if you're ever in question and sometimes are unsure of if your child needs mental health supports, those are the people to ask on campus. Ask the counselor, ask the psychologist, say, I've seen these types of behaviors. Is this typical? Is this not? I'm concerned about this. Don't feel like you have to take this alone and make this decision by yourself. That's why we have these folks on campus, is to help you navigate mental health concerns and determine what the best next steps are. These folks have a lot of experience working with families and students that are dealing with traumatic events, but also mental health issues. I would say the best thing is if you really feel like you've seen a sudden change in behavior, that your child is not able to perform their daily tasks like they usually do, if they're not able to be social and, progress academically and socially and emotionally, and you're seeing this type of change in behavior, then you would want to seek help. Okay, and ask some questions with the folks that can help you on your school site.
Okay, so this other question comes, will there be seminars in the future that addresses trauma not related to COVID, such as loss, abandonment of a parent, abuse, crime, etc.? Can some of the things that you talked about here kind of relate to that? Could you just address that?
Yes, I think that we talk about COVID a lot because it's been so traumatic to us and our student body and our population and transitioning back to school. But these type of traumatic events, across the board, any type of traumatic event can then lead to very similar interventions and way to intervene. So no matter if you're perhaps, your family is handling a divorce, or your child has been exposed to verbal abuse or physical abuse, perhaps, or there's been a natural disaster, and there's so many traumatic events. But you would want to do some of those same things that Miss Angela was talking about. Try to remain calm. Have that consistent routine. Talk to your child about their feelings no matter what type of traumatic event. These are some really good strategies to use.
And remember, it's, like Elizabeth said, trauma doesn't affect, or a particular situation doesn't always affect everyone in the same way. So I often say this, many soldiers went to Vietnam. Not everyone has PTSD. We just don't know how we're going to react to the trauma. So, having a loss or, a divorce in the family, or a death of a family member, or your house burning down, those are certainly traumatic events, but not everyone handles them in the same way. So it's important that you look for those changes in behavior that might be attributable to trauma versus saying, oh my goodness, this happened, so now this is automatically going to happen to my child or, anyone else that might have gone through that experience.
That's good to know. Thank you for that. Another question is, how do I best gauge when my child is exhibiting these traumatized behaviors versus just going through some normal emotions at his age, and they're at the young teenager age?
You just don't know. That's the most difficult time, because lots of that, wanting to be with their friends, isolating, the increase of social media. I mean, can be typical adolescent behavior, or it could be a sign that maybe they're, sad or upset or feeling, isolated. So I think you need to just be looking for those sudden drastic changes, kind of doing a temperature check, checking in with your student, keeping that communication line open, even though they want to not maybe communicate as much as you would like to with them. Because some of that behavior is typical behavior, moving away from wanting to do things with family, wanting to spend more time focused on their friends. That's typical adolescent behavior. But I think if it's impacting, they're not showing any enjoyment in anything, they're not finding, they're constantly kind of sad or sullen. I mean, those are kind of the warning signs that, there might be more of a concern. I don't know if that answered your question, or Elizabeth, if you want to add anything.
No, I think you're right. And that's, it's the age-old question of like, well, what's, my child being typical teen or preteen, or, transitioning just because their overall personality is changing versus, their suffering. I think Angela said it right. You have to communicate with your child and just know that when, they're not showing that ability to, be a productive, citizen per se, like, okay, we're going to do this, and you're going to go to school, and you're going to go to, we do this, social event every weekend, and they're making plans and futuristic things. And, those are typical type of behaviors. And then when we say, like, I don't want to go anywhere because I'm so anxious or I'm so upset, I don't want to participate in this anymore. And they're not maybe participating in something new or different. They aren't replacing their likes. This is where it would cause to be concerned because this is a change. And we would want to get to why that's occurring and why it's affecting them so much.
All right, thank you for that. And I don't see that there are any additional questions. If you do have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the chat. I saw some requests for the PowerPoint and the recording. Yes, this session is being recorded and it will be published on our YouTube page. Mercedes is going to put the link to that YouTube page in the chat so you all can grab a hold of it. And there it is. It's right there. If you subscribe to that channel, you'll be able to get this session and any other session that we do. All the other sessions that we recorded are there as well, but any moving forward, you will get a notification when any of the sessions are uploaded. And we have a lot of great suggestions from this group about futuristic topics. I did see another question come through while I was talking. How can I help my child with ADD?
Oh, that's a fun one. Yeah, attention deficit disorder, ADD. That has many different types of interventions. It's mostly a focusing concern. So I would really start with, talking to your child's pediatrician just to make sure that, you're ruling out any physical ailments. Describe why exactly you feel your child is, having this difficult time with their attention and their focus and their ability. And then there are many different ways to treat that. There's therapeutic ways, which we teach our students and our children strategies on how to calm themselves down, how to remain focused, taking breaks, doing something that will ease them so they are able to focus. And there are other routes too, such that are more intensive, such as medication, but none of that would happen without a consult from a doctor or a therapist, a psychiatrist, psychologist that would be able to help you navigate those types of signs and symptoms.
And I think too, I'll just share, there's a presentation that we do and we talk about that. And it talks about many different famous people that have ADD or ADHD. And one of them that I highlight is Michael Phelps. And he is the youngest. He's the only boy. His mother is a retired school principal and thought that his behavior was kind of just typical behavior. Because he was a boy and he was very active. And then as he went on in school, she kept hearing the same things like, I can't get his attention. It's hard for him to settle down, those sorts of things. And he was finally, I believe it was third or fourth grade, was diagnosed with ADHD. And she talked about really educating him about it. And so teaching him techniques, they had a lot of structure in their life. The swimming became part of it, making sure he slept, making sure his nutrition was good. But she said they even had a special symbol when he would become kind of hyper aroused and very hyper, what we think about that typical is she would just put up a C. She would just make the C like this and nobody would really know what she was doing. And that was her signal to him to calm down, that he was a little hyper because he was trying to control it without medication. So I think there's lots and lots of strategies out there, lots of choices for parents to make, and you really have to find the one that fits best for your particular family's temperament and your child's particular, how they exhibit that diagnosis, because it can be different.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And with that, everyone is saying how wonderful and informational this presentation was. We want to thank everyone for being with us this early afternoon. And for us, that's pretty late, but we want to thank everybody, the whole social services team. I see we have the executive director, Holly Saya, on. My executive director for FACE, Dr. Felita Lewis, is on. So we want to thank you all for being here. Are there any last words?
We just want to thank you for this opportunity to present this information. Any way we can get the word out to support the mental health needs of our students and families, we would like to. So appreciate your time and for allowing us to talk about this really important topic. And we hope to do more of these in the future.
And I would like to say, Angela, please, I put the phone number in the chat box, 273-7136. If anyone ever has any difficulties, they can reach out to us and we will help them in any way that we can. We've got an awesome team and we are here to support the children in our district.
Okay. Holly, could you say that number again? I'm going to type it in the chat once again.
Yes, I put it in this chat. It's 813-273-7136. And that will get them to my secretary and she will let us know what we need to do to help out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. With that, we're going to say good night to everyone. And hopefully we will hear from you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Good night.